A Werewolf Shifter Romance, written by Amelia Hart. Chapter 1. The Forest Knows Her Secrets. The cavern smelled of damp stone and the metallic tang of blood that never quite washed away, no matter how many times Verena scrubbed her hands in the mountain spring. 8 years had passed since the villagers drove her into these woods, with brands that seared her flesh, and accusations that burrowed deeper than any physical wound ever could. 8 years of solitude, of survival, measured not in heartbeats, but in harvests, in seasons that melted into one another like the wax of forgotten candles. She moved through the darkness with the ease of someone who had learned that shadows were kinder companions than people. Her fingers trailed across the granite walls as she descended deeper, where the air grew thick and ancient, where the world felt like it belonged only to her. Verena was 28 now, though she carried the weariness of someone twice her age. The mirror she kept in a cracked piece of polished metal showed her a stranger. Hollow cheeks, eyes the color of old emeralds, and that premature silver threading through her dark hair that had begun appearing years before its time. The amulet hung beneath her tunic, warm against her skin, despite the chill that never left these caverns. Her mother's final gift, wrapped in cloth so old it crumbled at the touch. Verena had found it hidden beneath the floorboards of the cottage where she'd grown up. Discovered it the same day she'd found the leather journal with her mother's shaky handwriting, covering pages and pages of warnings, genealogies, and names that meant nothing to her until much later. Names like Luna, names like power, names that had terrified her when she finally understood what they meant. Her mother had died when Verena was 15, the consumption taking her slowly, pulling her away like the tide pulling back from shore. Before the end came, she'd squeezed Verena's hand with surprising strength and whispered something that made no sense at the time. "You are not what they will tell you. Remember that when the strange things start. Remember that you are not cursed, you are chosen." Verena had thought it delirium, the fever talking. But then the strange things had started. Animals obeying her without command. Crops growing where nothing should flourish. A presence in her mind that felt almost like communication from the world around her. At 20, living with her father's new wife in the village of Millbrook, Verena had finally accepted the truth. She was different. She was something other. And the diary entries, the genealogy records traced back generations, pointed to lineages that human women simply did not possess. Her father had been more than he'd ever told her. Her mother had been something different still. Then came the poisoning. The alpha of their region, a man named Garrett Sr., had died under mysterious circumstances. He'd consumed tea from the tavern that day, and by evening he was convulsing, blood seeping from his mouth. The death was violent, spectacular in its cruelty. The village needed someone to blame, needed an explanation that made sense within their narrow worldview. They found her herbs, rare ones that grew only in the deep forest. They found her isolation suspicious. They found her strangeness damning. A young man named Garrett Jr., who had grown up alongside her, pointed his finger and testified that he'd seen her whispering curses, her hands moving in unnatural patterns. He swore she'd spoken words in a language he couldn't name, that her eyes had glowed in the candlelight. The village believed him because fear was contagious, because the need for vengeance was stronger than the need for justice. She hadn't poisoned anyone. Verena had been in the forest that day, collecting herbs for remedies, living as she always did on the edges of society. But the truth mattered less than the story, less than the blame that could be placed on a convenient outsider. They'd branded her with the marks of exile, deep cuts that formed a pattern meant to identify her as shifter kind, as one who'd violated the sacred law of secrecy. She'd been told that any shifter who revealed herself to humans would be hunted, executed without mercy, that her actions had betrayed them all. Except she hadn't acted at all. The cave became her sanctuary, though she knew now it was a prison built from lies. She'd survived by becoming what they'd accused her of being, a creature of the wilderness, a being separate from civilization. The forest provided for her because she had learned, through means she still didn't fully understand, to ask it for what she needed. Animals brought her news from the villages. Wild herbs grew abundant beneath her feet. She'd built a life that was almost bearable if she didn't think too deeply about the one she'd lost. The amulet pulsed with warmth against her chest, a feeling she'd learned not to question. It grew warmer when shifters passed near her cavern, which didn't happen often. She suspected the marks on her forearms kept most of them away. They would see her as a cautionary tale, as a shifter who'd failed to keep the secret, who'd proven that their kind couldn't be trusted. In the distant world beyond her mountain, the kingdoms shifted with political currents she barely understood. There was an Alpha King now, a man who ruled all the alphas in his region. Brennus, they called him. Verena had heard his name whispered by travelers who occasionally strayed close enough to her territory. She knew he'd taken the throne young, under unclear circumstances, that he commanded respect through both power and strategy. She knew these things the way she knew many things, through observation, through the gossip of merchants and wanderers, through the information that seeped into her solitude like water through stone. She knew nothing about the moment that would change everything. In the fortress of Thornhold, several days' journey to the east, Brennus sat in his library surrounded by books so ancient, their pages threatened to dissolve into dust at the merest touch. His pale fingers, bearing the marks of his authority, traced across genealogies that his predecessors had kept secret. The registers of shifter hierarchy, they were called in the private scrolls that only the Alpha King was permitted to see. His advisor Aldous had presented a curious problem. A shifter woman in the forest beyond Millbrook, one who apparently commanded animals, who displayed abilities that exceeded normal Omega capabilities. Aldous had come personally to the fortress, his face bearing that thin smile that made Brennus's wolf stir beneath his skin with warning. The scar on Aldous' face caught the candlelight. That scar Brennus himself had given him 7 years ago, when Aldous had challenged his authority and failed. "She practices forbidden magic," Aldous had said, his voice smooth as silk over broken glass. "I have testimony that she poisoned one of the alphas years ago. She commands animals unnaturally. She represents a threat to the stability of our entire hierarchy." Brennus had listened with half his attention, nodding while his mind analyzed what Aldous wasn't saying. The words were too clean, too convenient. Aldous wanted something, and a woman in a forest cavern provided a justification that few would question. But something about the reports niggled at Brennus's instincts, something that didn't align with the information about forbidden magic. He'd gone to the oldest records, the ones kept locked behind wards that only an Alpha King could break. The histories had been deliberately obscured over centuries, their edges worn smooth by someone's careful hand. But Brennus was patient, and what he found there made his entire understanding of their world shift like sand. Lunas. The word appeared again and again in texts that should have been forgotten. Women who bore a different kind of power, one that transcended the typical alpha-beta-omega hierarchy. Women whose authority was recognized instinctively by all shifters. Women who had been systematically hunted and executed 300 years ago because the alphas of that era had feared what they represented. The last Luna had died when Brennus's great-great-grandfather was young. The bloodlines had been diluted deliberately, scattered across generations, mixed with human stock to ensure the power would never resurface. It was supposed to be impossible for a true Luna to emerge in this age, which meant either the records were wrong or something impossible was living in a cavern beyond Millbrook. Brennus had made a decision that would send 8 white wolves into the forest at dawn, commanded to find the woman Aldous described and bring her to him alive. They were his elite guard, descendants of an ancient lineage themselves, and they would not fail. But as he'd given those orders, something deep within him had stirred. His wolf had recognized the possibility before his human mind could articulate it. Something was drawing him forward, like a current beneath the surface of the world, pulling him toward a destiny he didn't yet understand. Chapter 2. 8 wolves, 1 truth. The forest held its breath as night descended like a predator settling into position. Verena had felt them coming for hours, the disturbance in the air that meant other shifters were drawing near. She'd learned to recognize the sensation over her years of exile, a subtle vibration in the world around her that spoke of transformation and primal power moving through the wilderness. Her hands had trembled as she prepared, gathering what little she possessed that might serve as defense. a knife with a blade worn thin from use. The knowledge that her small cavern offered limited escape routes. The amulet pulsed against her chest, warmer than it had ever been. She didn't know what had drawn them, these strangers who moved through her forest like they owned it. Perhaps word of her existence had spread beyond the village boundaries. Perhaps the Alpha King, whose name she'd heard whispered with respect and fear in equal measure, had finally decided she was worth hunting. The thought made her stomach twist into knots she couldn't untangle. When they emerged from the darkness, it was like watching night itself take physical form. 8 wolves, enormous and luminous in the moonlight filtering through the cavern opening. Their pelage was pristine white, with silvery undertones that caught the pale glow, making them appear almost ethereal. Verena had never seen shifters that resembled any natural creature less. These were beings of myth and nightmare, power incarnate in lupine form. She rose to her feet, with movements she forced to remain steady. Fear wanted to paralyze her, but 8 years of survival had taught her that surrender was another word for death. The wolves fanned out, their formation suggesting military precision rather than animal instinct. Their eyes, intelligent and calculating, tracked her movement across the cavern floor. One of them, larger than the others with pure white fur unmarked by silver, stepped forward with authority radiating from every muscle. That one was their leader. She understood this the way prey understands predators. "I have nothing you want," Verena called out, her voice steadier than her nerves had any right to be. The knife felt inadequate in her hand, a child's toy against such power. "If you're here to finish what the village started, do it quickly." The largest wolf made a sound, not quite a growl, not quite acknowledgement. The others shifted their weight, and Verena realized with a start that they were nervous. These magnificent creatures, clearly trained and deadly, were displaying signs of uncertainty. Their ears swiveled toward one another as if seeking guidance that wasn't coming. When they attacked, it was without the coordination she might have expected. The largest lunged forward, and Verena dove sideways, the knife coming up instinctively. She'd never fought a shifter before, had never needed to. She struck out with desperation fueling her movements, and felt the blade connect with fur, with something warm beneath. The wolf yelped and pulled back, its enormous head swinging toward her with surprise rather than anger. The other wolves surged forward, and Verena stumbled backward, the cavern walls closing in around her. She was trapped here, a fox cornered by hounds, except these weren't hounds. These were something far more terrible and far more complex. Then something extraordinary happened. As the white wolves moved toward her, each one lowering themselves to the stone floor, their massive bodies sank down, and their heads bowed. Not in the graceful motion of predators preparing to strike, but in the unmistakable posture of submission. One by one, the 8 shifted their entire bearing, their ears flattening against their skulls, their bodies curving inward in a gesture that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Verena froze, the knife still raised before her. She watched as the largest wolf, the one who'd lunged first, turned its enormous head sideways in what could only be interpreted as an offer of vulnerability. Its neck lay exposed, the powerful muscles uncovered, completely defenseless against her blade. "What are you doing?" she whispered, confusion replacing terror as the primary emotion coursing through her. The largest wolf made a sound, somewhere between a whine and a howl, that seemed torn from deep within its chest. Its amber eyes fixed on hers, and Verena saw something there that shouldn't have existed in an animal's gaze. Recognition. Acknowledgement. A bowing to something it perceived in her that commanded obedience on an instinctive level she couldn't comprehend. The other 7 maintained their submissive postures, their breathing heavy and labored in a way that suggested internal struggle. Their muscles trembled with tension, their eyes darting between Verena and their leader in patterns that suggested conflict. They wanted to move, but something was preventing them, some biological imperative overriding whatever commands they'd been given. "I don't understand," Verena said, and her voice sounded small and lost in the vast cavern space. But understanding came gradually, like dawn breaking over unfamiliar terrain. These wolves recognized something in her blood that spoke to theirs in a language older than words, more primal than training or hierarchy. The largest wolf had tried to follow orders, had attempted to subdue her as instructed, but something deeper had risen in opposition. An ancient instinct that knew superiority when it encountered it, that bowed to power it recognized as its superior. The tension in the cavern grew unbearable. The struggle was visible in the trembling of lupine bodies, in the way the largest wolf's legs shook with the effort of maintaining its submissive posture while fighting invisible chains of biology and will. Its chest heaved with ragged breaths, as if it was drowning in air. Verena slowly lowered the knife. "You can fight it," she said quietly. "Whatever they told you to do. You can resist." The largest wolf's head jerked up at her words. For a moment, Verena thought it might attempt to obey its original commands after all. Instead, it made a series of sharp barks, sounds of urgency and warning that the other 7 seemed to understand. They moved with sudden coordinated violence despite their submissive positioning, and Verena realized too late what was happening. The largest wolf pinned her against the cavern wall, its enormous weight pressing the air from her lungs. Not to attack, she understood that now, but to immobilize. Its massive jaws closed near her neck, but never touched her skin. The other wolves surged around her, their bodies creating a cage of fur and muscle that left no room for escape. She tried to struggle, but there was no use. Her knife clattered to the stone floor and was lost in the confusion. Verena felt something heavy strike the back of her head. Not the bite she'd expected, but the shoulder of a lupine body, precise and controlled. The world tilted sideways. The cavern spun like she was caught in a whirlpool. And the last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was those amber eyes, full of something that might have been apology, watching her fall. When Verena's consciousness faded completely, the 8 wolves stood rigid above her body. The largest one, Royce, lowered his great head and released a sound that was entirely unexpected from such a fearsome creature. It was a whimper, almost a plea directed at the stars above the cavern. They'd been ordered to bring her alive and unharmed. They'd accomplished that much. But something had happened in the cavern that none of them could have predicted. Something that violated every law of hierarchy and training. Their bodies recognized an authority in this woman that superseded the Alpha King's commands, and the conflict of those 2 imperatives had left them shattered. Royce shifted his massive form carefully, cradling Verena's unconscious body with surprising gentleness. The other wolves formed a protective circle around them, and together they began the journey back toward the fortress of Thornhold, carrying news that would reshape everything Brennus believed about his world and his destiny. By the time they arrived at the fortress gates, dawn was breaking over the kingdom. The guards who'd been expecting the return of Brennus's elite guard were unprepared for what they witnessed. 8 white wolves moving with unusual purpose, carrying an unconscious woman into the fortress with movements that suggested reverence rather than capture. Royce transformed back into his human form as soon as they passed the threshold, his naked body glistening with sweat and exertion. His expression was grim, haunted by something he didn't possess the words to describe. The other 7 followed suit, all of them bearing the same disturbed countenance. "We have to tell the Alpha King immediately," one of them said, his voice shaking. "Something is wrong. Something is very wrong with what happened in that forest." Royce looked down at Verena's still form, her face peaceful in unconsciousness, that strange silver threading through her dark hair, catching the early light streaming through the fortress windows. "Wrong doesn't begin to describe it," he said quietly. "Our bodies wouldn't obey our minds. Every instinct we possess rose up and demanded we submit to her. We've never experienced anything like it. Never even heard of anything like it. The story would reach Brennus within the hour, and it would change everything." Chapter 3. The Awakening of Recognition. The chamber was unlike anything Verena had ever known. Stone walls, yes, but tapestries hung from them, woven scenes of hunts and ceremonies that suggested civilization rather than captivity. Sunlight streamed through a window that overlooked a vast courtyard below, where people moved like ants across paved stone. A bed with actual linen sat against one wall, and a table bore a pitcher of water so clean it gleamed like glass. She didn't trust any of it. Verena had awakened with her skull pounding, and her memories fragmented. She remembered the weight of wolves, the sensation of falling, and then nothing but darkness. She'd been unconscious, brought here against her will, delivered to whatever fate the Alpha King had decided for her. The bandits and exiles she'd encountered over 8 years had been preferable to this. At least with them, the danger was honest and immediate. The door opened without warning, and she tensed, backing toward the far corner of the chamber. Her hands curled into fists, though she possessed no weapons, and her strength was exhausted from travel and trauma. The man who entered was nothing like she'd imagined. Brennus was taller than she'd expected, his frame composed of lean muscle and controlled power, rather than the bulk she'd anticipated. His black hair was pulled back from his face, revealing features that were sharp and angular, almost dangerous in their precision. But it was his eyes that caught her, that pale amber that seemed to glow with intelligence, and something else she couldn't name. "You're afraid," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm alive," Verena replied, her voice hoarse. "Forgive me if I don't celebrate." Something flickered across his expression. Amusement, perhaps, or recognition of her defiance. He wore dark leather adorned with silver, the clothing of authority and combat, and he carried himself with the unself-conscious assurance of someone accustomed to obedience. "My name is Brennus," he said, moving deeper into the chamber. His movements were deliberate, non-threatening, which made Verena trust him less. "I am the Alpha King. You've been brought here regarding serious allegations. I want to hear your side of what happened." The interrogation that followed was unlike any she'd experienced. Brennus didn't shout or make threats. He simply asked questions. And something in his demeanor made lying feel futile. She found herself explaining everything. Her childhood, her mother's death, the discovery of the diary and amulet, the strange manifestations of power that began at 20. She told him about Millbrook, about the poisoning of the Alpha, about waking to find herself accused and marked for exile. "Garrett Jr. testified against you," Brennus said, his fingers steepled before him as he listened. "He claimed you cursed the Alpha, that he saw you performing rituals." "He lied," Verena said flatly, "or was made to believe the lie was true. I was in the forest that day. I had nothing to do with any poisoning." Brennus was quiet for a long moment, and Verena felt something strange happening. It was as if he was reading her in a way that went beyond words, as if his gaze was perceiving truths she hadn't even spoken aloud. When he finally spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. "You're telling the truth. Your body doesn't know how to form the deceptions that your mouth would need to speak." Relief flooded through her at being believed, followed immediately by suspicion. "How can you possibly know that?" "I am Alpha," he said simply. "We can sense deception in the scent of another shifter, in the way their heart beats, in the chemicals their body releases when lying. Garrett Jr.'s testimony was riddled with falsity. Either he was coerced or he believed something that wasn't true. But you," he paused, his amber eyes studying her with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. "You were exiled for a crime you didn't commit." The injustice of it crashed over her like a wave. Years of isolation and pain suddenly having a name. She felt something inside her fracture, and then something else began to grow in the space where the fracture opened. Anger, yes, but also something stranger. The plants on the table beside him began to change. Verena watched in horror as the dried flowers in the vase suddenly bloomed, green spreading across their withered petals, color returning to tissue that should have been long dead. The stems extended, growing upward with visible speed, leaves unfurling in defiance of seasons and death itself. Brennus rose from his chair, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he moved closer, his eyes fixed on the impossible phenomena occurring around them. "What is this?" he asked, but his tone held no fear. Only fascination, and something that sounded like recognition. "I don't know," Verena whispered. "It happens when I'm emotional. I can't control it." He reached out and touched one of the newly grown leaves, his fingers gentle against the verdant surface. "Do you understand what you are?" When she didn't respond, he moved to the chamber's bookcase and withdrew a volume so ancient its spine had crumbled to dust. He opened it with reverence, turning pages until he found what he sought. "These are the oldest records," he said, his voice low and careful, "before they were hidden, before they were deliberately obscured. There are accounts of women throughout our history who possessed power that transcended the normal hierarchy, power that was recognized instinctively by all shifters. They were called lunas. The word meant nothing to Verena, and yet it meant everything. Something in her chest responded to it, resonating with a frequency that felt ancient and true. Lunas were systematized, hunted, and executed 300 years ago. Brennus continued, his finger tracing the faded text. They were seen as threats to the established order of alphas. The bloodlines were deliberately diluted, scattered across generations with human stock to ensure the power would never resurface. It was considered impossible for a true Luna to emerge in this age. He looked up from the book, meeting her eyes directly. And yet you exist. The connection between them shifted in that moment. Verena felt something awaken inside her consciousness, a thread of awareness that connected to Brennus in a way she couldn't explain or deny. His breathing changed, became deeper, more deliberate. His amber eyes brightened slightly, the pupils expanding as if responding to a signal she'd inadvertently sent. Neither of them moved. Neither of them could. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Royce, who entered without the courtesy of knocking. His expression was urgent, his body tense with the need to communicate something significant. "Alpha King," he said, then noticed Verena and paused. His eyes widened slightly as he perceived her presence in the chamber, alone with Brennus in violation of multiple protocols. "What is it?" Brennus asked, his tone sharp with command, though his gaze remained fixed on Verena. "Aldous has called for a gathering of all regional alphas," Royce reported, his voice steady but edged with concern. "He claims to have evidence of a significant threat to our hierarchy. He's organizing meetings at neutral territory. Word is spreading quickly through the networks. He's demanding that certain accusations be addressed immediately." The spell between Verena and Brennus fractured like glass struck by stones. The awareness she'd felt dissipated, leaving her feeling hollow and exposed. "What accusations?" Brennus asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "He's claiming that the woman you brought here represents a danger to all alphas," Royce said carefully. "He's using the term Luna, which hasn't been spoken in official circles for centuries. He's telling the other alphas that if she's allowed to awaken fully, she'll threaten the established power structure. He's calling for her immediate execution." Brennus stood very still, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "That," he said quietly, "will not happen." But even as he made the declaration, Verena could see the calculation beginning in his eyes. The political calculation that would determine whether his personal certainty about her innocence could withstand the collective fear of every alpha in the region. The question of whether love, if that's what was awakening between them, could survive the pressure of an entire hierarchy designed to prevent exactly what was happening to them both. Outside the chamber, in the fortress corridors, word was already spreading. The Alpha King had brought the cursed woman from the forest into his private chambers. He'd spent hours alone with her. The 8 white wolves had acted strangely in the forest, according to the guards who'd debriefed them. Something unprecedented was occurring at Thornhold, and not everyone was pleased. Aldous, in particular, was smiling. Chapter 4: The Library and the Conspiracy. 3 days passed before Brennus moved Verena from her chamber to a suite that occupied an entire wing of the fortress. The rooms were designed for comfort rather than confinement, with windows that overlooked terraced gardens and corridors that connected to the castle's private spaces. Gone were the guards stationed outside her door. Instead, servants moved through the halls bearing fine linens and meals prepared with meticulous care. It was a transformation that felt less like mercy and more like a gilded cage designed to be beautiful enough that a prisoner might forget they were trapped. But Verena had learned in 8 years of exile that beauty could mask danger just as effectively as it concealed threats. "You're adjusting well," Brennus observed, finding her in the library on the 4th morning. He moved between the shelves with the ease of someone who'd spent countless hours in this space, his fingers trailing across leather spines of books written in languages she didn't recognize. "I'm breathing," Verena replied carefully. "Survival and adjustment aren't the same thing." A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Your honesty is refreshing. Most people in this fortress spend their time telling me what they believe I want to hear." He spent more time with her over the following days. They spoke in the library during afternoons when the light fell in golden columns through tall windows. He explained the politics of the shifter world, the delicate balance of power between regional alphas that required constant negotiation and compromise. She learned that Aldous held significant influence in the Southern Territories, that his ambitions had been evident for years, that there were whispers of dissatisfaction with Brennus's leadership among certain factions. "Why are you telling me this?" Verena asked during one of these sessions. "It seems like information you wouldn't share with someone who was recently brought here as a prisoner." "Because I trust you," Brennus said simply, and the directness of it made something shift inside her chest. "And because you need to understand the situation you're in. The political situation, not just the personal one." He showed her genealogies that traced her maternal line back through generations. They found records of a woman named Lysandra, dated back 230 years, who was documented as a Luna before the systematic hunts began. The bloodline had been deliberately fractured after her execution, scattered across human families and obscured by time. But Verena's mother had somehow carried the genetic markers, against all odds, against everything that should have made her birth impossible. Verena existed. "You're the first genuine Luna in 3 centuries, Brennus said, his hand resting near her on the ancient page. "The first in living memory. The first that anyone alive has ever encountered." The weight of that knowledge settled over her like winter snow, heavy and suffocating. On the 8th day of her residence in the fortress, Aldous came to visit. Verena was walking through one of the external courtyards when she saw him approach. His appearance was striking, tall and imposing, with that distinctive scar running the length of his face, a permanent reminder of violence and defeat. His eyes were a cold brown that held nothing of warmth or mercy. "So you're the cursed woman from the forest," he said, his voice carrying an accent that suggested he'd traveled extensively. "Brennus's latest fascination." "I don't know you," Verena replied, though something in the way he looked at her triggered a response in her instincts. There was malice there, carefully controlled, but unmistakably present. "No, but I know you," Aldous said. His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Or rather, I knew your situation very well. The poison that killed the Alpha in Millbrook, the accusations that followed, the convenient placement of blame on a shifter who couldn't defend herself." He paused, letting each word sink like stones into water. "That was my doing. The poisoning, the false testimony, all of it. And it was executed so perfectly that no one questioned the narrative I created." His voice never rose. The words were wrapped in the kind of velvet that leaves no prints. Verena felt something cold crystallize inside her. "You wanted to take his position." "I succeeded in taking it," Aldous corrected. "That region has thrived under my governance for 8 years. The Alpha's son, young Garrett, has been quite useful in maintaining the illusion that his father's death was entirely your fault. He honestly believes the story now. The mind is remarkable in that way. If you tell someone something often enough, if you make them believe they're remembering it rather than being told it, eventually the lie becomes their truth." "Why are you telling me this?" Verena asked, mirroring the question she'd posed to Brennus days before. But the context had changed entirely. "Because I want you to understand exactly how thoroughly you've been deceived about your own life," Aldous said. "Brennus brought you here thinking you're some special creature, some resurgent power that was thought extinct, but you're just a convenient tool. And when the other alphas realize what he's done, when they understand that he's protecting someone he clearly intends to mate with, his reign will crumble, and I'll be waiting to offer them a better alternative." He turned to leave, then paused. "The Alpha King believes in destiny and fate, and all the things that make rulers sentimental. But power is simpler than that. Power is taken, not given, and those who understand that basic truth always prevail." After he departed, Verena stood alone in the courtyard, trembling with a combination of rage and understanding. She'd been used, not by Brennus. She could feel the sincerity in his concern for her, but by circumstances that had orchestrated her entire life. The question now was whether she could survive what came next. That evening, Brennus found her in the library again. But this time her expression was guarded in a way that made his amber eyes narrow with concern. "You've seen Aldous," he said. It wasn't a question. He came to confess, Verena said. He wanted me to know that he orchestrated everything. The poisoning, the false testimony, my exile. He did it to take power, and it worked perfectly until you sent your wolves to fetch me. Brennus moved closer, his jaw tightening. He came to threaten you, to make you afraid. He succeeded, Verena admitted. But not in the way he intended. I'm not afraid of him. I'm afraid of what comes next. He's organizing the other alphas against you. He's building a coalition. I know, Brennus said quietly. I've known for days. Royce brought me reports. Aldous is calling for a gathering of all regional alphas within a fortnight. He's going to demand my abdication or your execution. Possibly both. Verena looked at him, seeing the conflict playing across his features. You should let me go. Release me. Claim you discovered I was innocent and let me return to the forest. Without me as a point of contention, he loses his leverage. No. The word was absolute, final. I won't do that. Then you'll lose everything, Verena said. Your power, your position, possibly your life. Brennus reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. I've lost everything worth having already. I've spent my entire life isolated by power, believing that maintaining authority required emotional distance. But I look at you and I see what I've been missing. I see possibility. Their faces were close now, the space between them charged with something that transcended the political maneuvering and threats surrounding them. Verena could feel her heart accelerating, could sense the shift in Brennus's breathing. He leaned closer, and she didn't pull away. The kiss was inevitable, unavoidable as gravity. It tasted of desperation and hope in equal measure, of two people recognizing something in each other that went beyond reason or safety. His hand moved to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with surprising tenderness. She felt the connection between them strengthen, becoming something more than attraction, something deeper and older. When they finally separated, both breathing heavily, Brennus rested his forehead against hers. I have a plan, he said quietly. For the gathering, for the confrontation. I'm going to present the truth to the alphas. I'm going to show them the genealogies, the historical records of Lunas. I'm going to tell them that you are the first of a bloodline that was thought extinct, and that your emergence represents a new era for our kind. I'm going to ask them to accept this rather than destroy it. And if they refuse, Verena asked, though she already knew the answer, then we deal with the consequences together, Brennus said. No running, no hiding, just truth and the future we build from it. Verena wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that love could survive political upheaval, that truth could defeat conspiracy, that their connection was strong enough to reshape the foundations of an entire society. But 8 years of exile had taught her to recognize the difference between hope and reality. Still, she didn't argue. Instead, she held him closer and tried to memorize the feeling of being protected, of being chosen, of being seen as something precious rather than something to be feared. Outside the library, in corridors that carried whispers and rumors, the fortress was already dividing. Alliances were shifting. Aldous' network was expanding, drawing support from alphas who feared the implications of Aluna's return. And Brennus was preparing for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of two people who'd found each other against impossible odds, but the future of an entire world. Chapter 5. The Assembly of Thorns. The grand hall of Thornhold stretched before them like the mouth of a beast, its vaulted ceiling soaring so high that torchlight barely reached the shadows pooling in its upper reaches. Tapestries depicting centuries of alpha victories hung from stone walls, each one a testimony to conquest and dominion. Brennus sat upon his throne, but it felt less like a seat of power and more like a trap he'd knowingly stepped into. 12 alphas filled the chamber, arranged in a semicircle that suggested both unity and potential fracture. Aldous stood at the center, his scarred face arranged in an expression of concerned superiority that made Verena's skin crawl where she stood near the great fireplace. She wore clothing that Brennus had selected, a gown of deep blue that suggested nobility rather than servitude, though she felt like a lamb dressed for slaughter. The evidence is substantial, Aldous was saying, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to swaying courts. He gestured toward documents spread across a stone table. Correspondence between myself and the late Alpha of Millbrook, dating back 8 years. Records of her actions in the forest. Multiple accounts from witnesses. Witnesses who were coerced or controlled. Brennus said quietly, but his voice cut through the hall like a blade through silk. Garrett Jr. has admitted under questioning that his testimony was compromised. The correspondence Aldous presents is conveniently damaged in ways that prevent verification of authenticity. Aldous smiled, and it was a predator's smile. The Alpha King is protecting the woman because he's already begun marking her with his presence. You can all smell it on him. The scent mixing that precedes a claiming. He's compromised his judgment. One of the Alphas stepped forward, a broad-shouldered man named Theron, who held territories to the north. Is this true, Brennus? Are you considering taking her as mate? The question hung in the air like poison gas, and Brennus took his time responding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried absolute certainty. I don't know yet. What I do know is that this woman is innocent of the crimes she was accused of. What I know is that she carries within her bloodline something that was thought extinct. She is Luna. The word created immediate chaos. Several Alphas stood, their voices rising in protest and denial. One of them, an older male with silver threading his dark hair, actually laughed. Lunas are mythology. They've been dead for 3 centuries. No, Brennus said, rising from his throne. The movement commanded attention through sheer force of presence. They were hunted to extinction. Deliberately executed because the Alphas of that era feared what they represented. Power that transcended the normal hierarchy. Authority that was recognized instinctively by all shifters. He gestured toward Verena. She is the first genuine Luna to emerge in living memory. Aldous didn't hesitate. Which is precisely why she must be eliminated. A Luna represents a threat to all of us. She could command any shifter, including the Alpha King himself. She could reshape the entire power structure we've spent centuries establishing. Surely you all understand that this cannot be allowed. The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over everyone present. Fear was a powerful tool, and Aldous wielded it with the expertise of a musician with a beloved instrument. I'm calling for a vote, Aldous announced. Either the Alpha King relinquishes his claim to her and allows for her immediate execution, or we consider him compromised and vote for his abdication. This cannot stand. The future of our entire civilization depends on this decision. Brennus descended from his throne, moving toward Verena. The action was deliberate, a public declaration of alliance that transcended politics. I stand with her. Whatever comes, I face it with her at my side. The vote took less than an hour. 7 Alphas voted in favor of Aldous' proposal. Only 5 remained loyal to Brennus. The mathematics of power had shifted, and the balance that had held for years suddenly tilted dangerously sideways. The Articles of Assembly allowed a simple majority to suspend a reigning Alpha King pending an inquiry. Aldous arrived with the inquiry already written. Aldous' forces moved with surprising coordination, as if they'd been planning this for longer than the meeting had taken to occur. Guards who wore his colors appeared at the Great Hall's exits. Verena felt panic rise in her throat as she was separated from Brennus by a wall of bodies, pulled away by hands that gripped with absolute authority. No, Brennus roared, his voice carrying the resonance of his wolf's fury. He transformed partially, his form shifting between man and beast as he fought toward her. But there were too many guards, too much organized resistance. They restrained him with chains of silver that burned his skin, keeping him from full transformation and from reaching across the distance that was rapidly becoming a chasm. Verena was taken to a sealed chamber deep within the fortress, one that had been built centuries ago to contain dangerous prisoners. The walls were reinforced stone, the door sealed with locks that required multiple keys to open. She paced like a trapped creature, feeling the mate bond that had only begun to solidify between her and Brennus now straining against the separation like a rope pulled to its breaking point. Through their connection, she felt his rage and despair. She felt his determination to break free. She felt, more importantly, his absolute refusal to surrender to Aldous' demands. That was when she realized something crucial had shifted. The mate bond, even incomplete and unmarked, had created a pathway of communication between them that transcended physical distance. She could sense his presence in her mind, a warm pressure against her consciousness that spoke of connection deeper than blood or breath. Meanwhile, in the fortress corridors, Royce made a choice that would seal his allegiance in ways that could never be undone. Aldous, confident in his victory, had ordered the execution of all shifters who remained loyal to Brennus. The command was given to Royce and a handful of other guards, a final test of their loyalty to the new regime that was establishing itself. Royce stood in the chamber where a dozen shifters were imprisoned, all of them warriors who'd served Brennus faithfully. The order was simple: execute them, and he would be rewarded with position and power under Aldous' rule. Refuse, and he would die alongside them. He looked at the faces of the imprisoned shifters, friends, brothers in arms, individuals he'd trained with and bled alongside, and something inside him crystallized into absolute resolve. No, he said to Aldous' representative, a thin-faced captain named Severin. I will not execute shifters under the banner of false command. Severin's expression hardened. Then you've chosen death. I've chosen honor, Royce corrected, and he moved with the swift violence of a predator, disarming the guards before they could draw weapons. The confrontation was brief and brutal. When it was over, Royce stood amid fallen enemies, his own body bleeding from multiple wounds, but the imprisoned shifters were freed. He made his way through the fortress corridors to where Brennus was being held, carrying keys that Aldous' forces had foolishly allowed him to possess. When he released the chains, Brennus transformed fully, his wolf form enormous and terrible in the confined space. Aldous has Verena, Royce said quickly. She's been taken to the lower cells. They're planning to execute her at dawn, publicly, to establish control and eliminate any possibility of her power being used against them. Brennus's wolf howled, a sound of rage and anguish that echoed through stone corridors and reached every corner of the fortress. Every shifter within hearing distance felt the weight of that howl, and many of them understood in that moment that they had chosen the wrong side. Throughout the night, things moved toward their inevitable collision. Brennus gathered the warriors who remained loyal. Royce brought additional allies, shifters who'd never wanted to follow Aldous, but had been afraid to resist. Verena, in her sealed chamber, felt the mate bond strengthening with every moment that passed, drawing power from the desperation and determination flowing through it. And in the courtyard where a pyre was being constructed for the execution at dawn, Aldous smiled and prepared for his final victory, never suspecting that he was actually walking toward his own destruction. Chapter 6. The Awakening. The night before the execution arrived with the weight of finality pressing down upon everything. Verena sat in her sealed chamber, the walls bearing ancient claw marks from prisoners who'd occupied this space centuries before her. She could feel Brennus through their connection, not in words, but in raw emotion transmitted across the invisible thread that now bound them. His determination, his fury, his unwavering refusal to accept defeat. The mate bond had grown stronger through their separation, becoming something almost unbearable in its intensity. Every moment apart felt like her heart was being torn from her chest. She understood now why shifters spoke of the mate bond with such reverence and terror. It was a force that transcended logic, that demanded presence, that made solitude feel like slow death. She spent the hours before dawn in meditation, following the guidance that seemed to emanate from the amulet resting against her skin. Her mother's bloodline was awakening within her, ancient knowledge that had lain dormant for 28 years suddenly becoming accessible. She could sense the shifters throughout the fortress, could feel their emotional currents like wind moving through invisible channels. Some radiated fear, others burned with righteous anger. A few flickered with the uncertainty of individuals caught between opposing loyalties. Around midnight, Verena felt something shift fundamentally within herself. It started as pressure behind her eyes, a building intensity that made her gasp. The mate bond flared brilliant in her consciousness, and suddenly she could perceive Brennus's location with absolute certainty. He was in the lower dungeons, his wolf form straining against silver chains. He was fighting to reach her with every fiber of his being, and that desperate battle was what was amplifying the connection between them. She placed her palm against the sealed door of her chamber, and pushed with her mind, not with physical strength. The power that flowed through her was ancient and boundless, and for the first time, she understood that she could direct it. The locks clicked open as if they'd never been sealed. The door swung inward on hinges that suddenly obeyed a command written in her blood rather than in metal and mechanism. The fortress corridors were nearly empty, most guards and servants having retired for the night. The few she encountered seemed unable to truly perceive her, as if her presence registered but didn't fully penetrate their awareness. It was a gift of her Luna nature, a manifestation of power that made her seem almost invisible to those she wished not to see her. She descended through levels of stone, following the pull of the mate bond like a compass needle seeking north. When she finally found Brennus, he was nearly in wolf form completely, only the surface of his human consciousness still clinging to control. The silver chains that bound him were burning through his skin, creating wounds that smelled of scorched flesh and blood. "Brennus," she whispered, and his entire body went rigid, his amber eyes fixed on her with such intensity that she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force. Without thinking, without hesitation, Verena extended her hand and touched the silver chains. They shattered like glass under the weight of her power, disintegrating into powder that scattered across the stone floor. Brennus transformed fully, his enormous wolf form filling the chamber. He pressed his great head against her, his breathing ragged and desperate. She felt his relief through the mate bond, felt his certainty that he would never let her be separated from him again. "We don't have much time," Verena said quietly. "They're executing me at dawn. They believe I'm still locked in the sealed chamber. They don't know you've been freed." Brennus's wolf form shifted, his body transforming back into human shape as he pulled her close. His skin was burned and bleeding, his eyes holding an urgency that transcended pain. "We're going to the courtyard. We're going to stop this before it begins, and I'm going to show them exactly what they're trying to destroy." When they emerged from the fortress into the pre-dawn darkness, the courtyard was already crowded. Aldous had arranged for the execution to be public, wanting witnesses to spread the story of what happened when someone defied the new order. A massive pyre had been constructed, its wood stacked high and ready for flames. A crowd of shifters had been summoned, some by choice, many by compulsion, to witness the death of the Luna. The courtyard churned with bodies and breathless rumor as dawn's rim of light lifted behind the battlements. Verena walked into the crowd beside Brennus and kept walking, past the guards whose hands twitched toward hilts, and then fell away as if their muscles forgot the order. She climbed the pyre herself, the wood stacked high enough that she rose above every watching face. No one stopped her. They only made a ring without understanding why. Aldous smiled like a man watching his own plans ripen, and never noticed that the harvest no longer belonged to him. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon when Verena closed her eyes and opened her consciousness completely to the power she'd been restraining for 8 years. It started as a sound, a song in a language that predated human speech, that carried within it the authority of generations of Lunas stretching back through centuries. The sound emanated from Verena's throat, and every shifter within hearing distance felt it resonate through their bones. The power that followed was visible as light. It radiated from her like dawn breaking across a mountain range, brilliant and golden and absolutely undeniable. The bonds that held her disintegrated. The pyre beneath her caught fire, but the flames burned the wood to ash in seconds, never touching her skin. Her form shifted, not into a wolf, but into something else entirely. Humanoid, but lupine, luminescent with barely contained power, ancient and terrible and magnificent. Lunas, when fully awakened, existed in a state between human and wolf that transcended the normal hierarchy of shifter forms. Verena's new form carried within it the authority of her entire bloodline, visible to every shifter present as a demonstration of power that couldn't be denied or explained away. She turned toward Aldous, and he stumbled backward, his scarred face draining of color as he finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. The shifters around him, those loyal to him, bound by his manipulation and promises, began to withdraw, their instincts screaming at them to submit to the Luna who now stood before them. All across the fortress and the surrounding territories, shifters felt the awakening of Luna power. It was a sensation that transcended time and distance, a recognition written into their DNA that something thought extinct had been resurrected. Some felt joy. Others felt fear. All of them felt the absolute certainty that everything had changed in the moment of her transformation. Brennus emerged from the fortress in wolf form, his massive body moving with the grace of an alpha at the height of his power. When he reached Verina's side, he lowered his head in an act of deliberate submission that sent shockwaves through the crowd. The Alpha King, the supreme authority over all regional alphas, was bowing to the Luna. The gesture was revolutionary. It declared that power had shifted, that the old hierarchy was being restructured, that the future would be built on different foundations than the past. Aldous tried to run, but Verina's power caught him before he'd taken more than a few steps. Not violently. She didn't harm him with her will, but she stopped him mid-motion, his body suddenly unresponsive to his commands. She held him suspended, unable to move, unable to transform, completely at her mercy. Through the mate bond, Brennus felt her internal debate. She could kill him. She could crush his will completely. She could make him suffer for every lie, every manipulation, every innocent life he'd destroyed to gain power. The temptation was enormous, a weight that pressed against her consciousness with the force of 8 years of exile and injustice. But Verina chose differently. She released Aldous, and he collapsed to the ground gasping. She extended her hand toward Brennus, and he transformed back into human form, taking her hand without hesitation. The touch of their joined hands created a visible pulse of power that radiated outward, touching every shifter present. "I am Luna," Verina said, her voice carrying the authority of ages. "And he is my mate. What comes next, we will determine together." Chapter 7. The Binding of Two Crowns. The aftermath of awakening hung over Thornhold like a veil separating the old world from the new. Shifters moved through the fortress corridors with uncertainty etched into their movements, struggling to process what they'd witnessed in the courtyard. The power displayed by Verina had shattered fundamental assumptions about hierarchy and capability, forcing a recalibration of everything they believed about their own society. Brennus stood at the entrance to the Grand Hall, still bearing the burns and wounds from his imprisonment. He'd refused treatment, insisting instead on addressing the gathered alphas immediately. Verina stood beside him, having returned to her humanoid form, the one that carried subtle lupine features, but maintained enough humanity to communicate her control rather than her wildness. The 12 alphas who'd voted for her execution moments before now gathered around her with expressions ranging from reverence to barely concealed fear. Theron, who'd stepped forward to question Brennus about his intentions, approached with cautious respect. "The situation has changed," Theron said carefully, his northern accent thick with understatement. "We need to establish new protocols, new understanding of what this means for all of us." "It means," Brennus said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "that we've been operating under incomplete information for 3 centuries. The Lunas weren't threats to our civilization. They were part of its foundation, part of the system that governed it, before fear caused us to destroy something precious." Verina stepped forward, and every shifter in the hall felt the pull of her presence. It wasn't coercive. She wasn't using her power to compel submission, but rather an acknowledgement of what they all now recognized as her superior status within their hierarchy. "I don't come to rule over you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I come to restore balance that was lost. The Alpha King and I will work together to establish a new structure, a consort system where Luna and Alpha share authority rather than one dominating the other." The Alphas exchanged glances, and Brennus could see the exact moment when most of them accepted this new reality. Fear was being replaced by pragmatism, by recognition that adaptation was preferable to resistance. Garrett Jr. was brought forward, his expression haunted by the knowledge of what he'd done. Years of magical coercion under Aldous' control had made him complicit in the suffering of an innocent woman. The weight of that knowledge was visible in his posture, in the trembling of his hands. "He acted under duress," Verina said, and her words caused visible relief to wash across Garrett Jr.'s features. "He was made to believe a lie so thoroughly that truth became impossible for him to recognize. His punishment will be exile from these territories for 7 years, during which he will work to make restitution to the people he harmed through his false testimony. It was mercy, but it was also justice. Garrett Jr. would live with the consequences of his actions without being destroyed by them. Some of the alphas seemed surprised by her leniency, but none questioned it. Aldous was a different matter entirely. He'd attempted to flee during the chaos of Verina's awakening, but had been intercepted by Royce and his supporters before he could reach the fortress borders. Now he stood before the assembled shifters, his scarred face twisted with hatred and defiance. He orchestrated the poisoning of a regional alpha 8 years ago, Verina stated, her voice carrying the formality of legal proceeding. He used magical coercion to fabricate false testimony. He conspired to incite civil war within our communities. He attempted to orchestrate the execution of an innocent woman to consolidate power. And? Aldous spat, his eyes glittering with malice. This is what alphas do. We take power. We hold it by any means necessary. You think establishing yourself as some mystical Luna changes that? You'll become just as corrupt as the rest of us. Verina's expression didn't change. You'll be exiled from all shifter territories permanently. You'll be stripped of your alpha status and your command over any pack. You'll carry the mark of your crimes so that any shifter you encounter will know what you've done. You'll live, Aldous, but you'll live knowing that your attempt to reshape the world through conspiracy instead reshaped nothing but your own fate. It was perhaps a more cruel punishment than execution. Aldous would live for decades potentially, forced to wander territories where he was universally despised, unable to claim status or authority, unable to build anything meaningful. As he was led away by guards, the real ceremony began. The ritual of bonding between Alpha King and Luna was something that hadn't been performed in 3 centuries. The knowledge of how to conduct it existed only in the oldest texts, in fragments of memory preserved by shifters who'd studied history. But Brennus and Verina didn't need the exact words or gestures. The mate bond between them was so strong by now that it seemed to guide them, drawing them toward actions that felt simultaneously ancient and inevitable. They stood before the alphas and the gathered shifters, and Brennus spoke first. I acknowledge Verina as my mate, chosen by fate and recognized by instinct. I offer myself to her as partner and protector, surrendering the isolation of solitary power for the strength that comes from shared authority. Then he leaned forward and marked her neck with his bite, not in violence, but in ceremony. His fangs pierced her skin, drawing blood that carried within it his acceptance of her as equal rather than subordinate. The mark that formed was visible even in her humanoid state, a crescent shape that glowed faintly with his alpha power. Verina's turn came, and she didn't hesitate. She transformed partially, allowing fangs to emerge, and marked Brennus with reciprocal authority. Her bite created a matching mark on his neck, but hers carried the weight of Luna power, making it shimmer with a quality that transcended ordinary mating marks. I acknowledge Brennus as my mate and partner, she said, her voice resonating with the power of her bloodline. I offer myself to him as equal and ally, sharing the burden of leadership and the joy of connection. The marks glowed where they touched each other's skin, creating a visible link between them that every shifter present could see. They'd marked each other not as possessions, but as acknowledgement of mutual choice, of partnership rather than dominance. When they kissed, it was a public declaration of intent. The kiss held passion, but also promise, held desire, but also commitment. It spoke of what they'd build together, of how they would reshape their world through cooperation rather than conquest. The gathering erupted into sounds of acceptance. Not all of the alphas were entirely comfortable with this new order, but they recognized that resistance was futile. Verina and Brennus represented something larger than any individual ambition could overcome. Over the following days, the structure of shifter governance was formally reorganized. A consort system was established where Luna and Alpha would share authority equally, each bringing their specific perspective to decisions that affected their kind. The consort position was created as an official rank that would sit alongside the Alpha King in all matters of state. Verina moved through the fortress learning about her new role, learning about the intricacies of shifter politics that extended far beyond Thornhold. She discovered that there were networks of packs across vast territories, that the hierarchy Aldous had disrupted had existed in delicate balance for centuries. One evening, She found herself in the library where she and Brennus had first truly connected. He was there, studying maps that showed the regional territories controlled by various packs. "I've been thinking," Verena said, settling beside him, "about what comes next. About whether my emergence is really the beginning of something new, or if it's just chaos we're trying to reorganize." "It's both," Brennus replied, his hand finding hers. "Every transformation is chaos until it settles into new patterns. We're building something that hasn't existed for 300 years. That's chaos by definition." "And the other Lunas?" Verena asked. "The ones that Royce mentioned might be awakening? What happens when they emerge?" "We'll face that when it comes," Brennus said. "But we'll face it together. That's what partnership means." The mate bond between them pulsed with contentment, with the deep satisfaction of two people who'd found not just love, but purpose in each other's existence. The trials ahead were real and significant, but they no longer faced them in isolation. Outside the library windows, winter was settling over the kingdom. Snow began to fall in gentle flakes, covering the fortress in white that glowed silver in moonlight. And within the ancient stones of Thornhold, the foundation of a new era was being laid, one where power was shared, where Luna and Alpha stood together as equals, and where the future remained gloriously uncertain. Chapter 8. A Future Reborn. 6 months had transformed Thornhold from a fortress of rigid hierarchy into something that resembled a living organism, learning to function with new limbs. The snow that had fallen during Verena's awakening had long since melted, replaced by spring growth that seemed almost excessive in its abundance. Flowers bloomed in the fortress gardens with impossible vibrancy, and Verena's presence had something to do with that phenomenon. The mate bond between her and Brennus had settled into something almost comfortable, though comfort wasn't quite the right word for the constant awareness she maintained of his location, his emotional state, his heartbeat echoing faintly through their connection. She stood in what had once been Aldis's private war room, now transformed into administrative space, where the consort managed the territories that had begun acknowledging the new power structure. Maps covered the walls, each one marked with the symbols of packs that had formally accepted Verena's authority and Brennus's continued leadership. The number grew daily, as news of what had transpired at Thornhold spread through shifter networks like wildfire through dry grass. Brennus entered without warning, which was his way. The mate bond allowed them to sense each other's movements, to navigate around one another with an ease that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago, when everything felt destined for collision. "The delegation from Millbrook has arrived," he said, settling into the chair beside her. His hand found hers without conscious thought, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. "They're requesting formal rehabilitation. They want to acknowledge their role in the false accusations against you." "How many this time?" Verena asked, though she already knew the answer through channels of communication that had been established between the fortress and various settlements. The mate bond extended their perception, allowing them to sense the emotional currents of shifters within their territories. "Most of the village," Brennus said. "The Alpha who replaced the one Aldis killed has been doing good work rebuilding trust. They've established protocols for verifying accusations before taking action. They've created a council that includes representatives from human settlements to prevent future disconnects between our world and theirs." Verena nodded, feeling something warm and satisfied settle in her chest. This was what she'd hoped for when she'd chosen not to execute Aldis, not to demand vengeance for 8 years of exile. The option for redemption extended generously to those willing to accept it. Change was happening incrementally, unevenly, but it was happening. The reforms to shifter law had been extensive. New protocols required that accusations of magical crimes be verified by multiple individuals with specific expertise. Witnesses could no longer be coerced magically without detection and consequence. The position of Luna was formally established as an advisory and executive role within the hierarchy, equal to the Alpha King in authority, though differentiated in scope. Brennus made decisions regarding warfare, territorial disputes, and political alliances. Verena made decisions regarding internal pack welfare, magical protocols, and the restoration of knowledge that had been deliberately hidden for centuries. Over the past 6 months, she'd discovered that the library at Thornhold, contained far more information about lunas than anyone had suspected. Ancient texts, buried beneath centuries of dust and deliberate misfiling, contained genealogies, magical training methods, and historical accounts of how lunas had actually functioned in society before the hunts. They'd been healers, counselors, teachers, authorities whose power derived from connection rather than dominance. "I had a message today," Verena said, shifting the conversation to something that had been occupying her thoughts. "Through the network of lunas who are beginning to awaken. There are at least 7 confirmed awakenings across the territories now. 7 more women discovering they carry Luna bloodlines." Brennus's expression became thoughtful. "The other alphas are going to be frightened by that." "Some are," Verena acknowledged. "But word travels. They know what happened when they tried to kill me. They know what lunas represent when they're allowed to exist rather than hunted. Fear is giving way to pragmatism." She paused, then added, "I'm planning to reach out to them directly, to establish a network where lunas can support each other through their awakenings. It won't be a consort system immediately. Most of them don't have alphas willing to share power yet. But eventually, that will change." The implications of what she was describing were enormous. A restructuring of shifter society that would take decades to implement, centuries perhaps to fully realize. But it was starting, and that was what mattered. That evening, they walked through the fortress gardens, and Verena found herself noticing things she hadn't before. The way certain plants grew in patterns that suggested intentional cultivation, rather than natural chaos. The way paths had been designed to lead a walker's eyes toward specific views. The care that had been invested in creating beauty, alongside function. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Verena said, as they settled on a stone bench overlooking the courtyard where her awakening had occurred 6 months before. The pyre had been dismantled, the ground restored. "If you didn't know the history, you'd never recognize this as the site of confrontation and transformation." "About the other lunas?" Brennus asked. "About that, yes. But also about personal things." She took his hand, placed it against her abdomen. "I haven't bled in 3 moon cycles. I've been too uncertain to say anything. But I've confirmed it through meditation and the connection with the herbal knowledge I've been recovering." Brennus's entire body went still. Through the mate bond, Verena felt the explosion of emotion he was experiencing. Joy, terror, protectiveness, and something deeper that transcended categorization. His hand remained pressed against her, trembling slightly. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice soft. "As certain as I can be about something we haven't experienced before," Verena said. "But yes, a child, a offspring who will carry both Alpha and Luna bloodlines. The implications of that are staggering," Brennus finished. "The child of an Alpha King and a Luna could reshape everything. The shifter hierarchy itself could be redefined by what your child becomes. Or it could be a human who shows no shifter capability whatsoever," Verena pointed out practically. "We don't know what the blending of these bloodlines will produce. We'll discover it together," Brennus said, leaning forward to press his forehead against hers. "That's what the mate bond means. Whatever comes, we face it together." Over the following weeks, the pregnancy became public knowledge. The response was mixed. Some shifters celebrated, seeing it as proof that the New World Order was legitimate and permanent. Others expressed concern, fearing what a child of such power might mean for their society. Still others simply waited, unsure how to feel until they could see what actually emerged from this unprecedented union. Royce came to visit one afternoon, bearing reports from the territories beyond Thornhold. He'd taken on a role as liaison between the various packs, ensuring that information flowed smoothly and misunderstandings were addressed before they could solidify into conflict. "Aldous was spotted near the southern border," he reported. "He's living among humans, trying to blend in. Some shifters wanted to pursue him, but I've counseled against it. He's harmless now, separated from power and support. Pursuing him would only create sympathy for him." Verena appreciated Royce's strategic thinking. In 6 months, he'd become one of the fortress's most valuable assets, someone who understood the nuance of leadership in this transitional period. As spring turned toward summer, Verena found herself spending time in the archives of shifter history, preparing. She was gathering information about Luna pregnancies, about the births of children with significant power, about how previous societies had managed the emergence of exceptional individuals. It was preparation that felt both necessary and utterly inadequate. In quiet moments, she stood in the garden where she'd first felt her power fully awakening, and she could sense the connections extending outward from her position. Each awakened Luna, each reformed pack, each family learning to trust shifters again after years of fear. It was a network of change, fragile but growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as Brennus and Verena stood together watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed almost too vivid to be real, she felt it, a ripple in the fabric of shifter consciousness, unmistakable and profound. Another Luna, the eighth one, had awakened somewhere far to the east. And with that awakening came a sense of something vast and inevitable beginning to move. A transformation that would reshape their world for generations to come. Brennus's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Are you ready for this?" Verena considered the question carefully. She was ready for the challenges ahead, for the resistance and the celebrations, for the unknown future that was still being written. But most importantly, she was ready because she wasn't facing it alone anymore. She had a mate, a partnership, a connection that transcended power or hierarchy. "Yes," she said finally, "I'm ready." The end.